Would you ask Mrs. Turner to come back in, please? Thank you. All right, Mrs. Turner?
Yes, thank
ready
you.
to keep going?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, Ms. Hines.
Thank you. Mrs. Turner, before the break, we were talking about the extra assessment of the BBA in July 2017. Can we return to the assessment report at UKAS 301077? And again, we see that that is the extra visit report, and it is July 2017. Can we go to page 3, please? Under the executive summary, and I want to start at the 4th paragraph down, starting with the UKAS, the UKAS assessment activity. Can I have that scrolled up a little bit? Thank you. The UKAS assessment activity comprised a review of the records associated with the certification and the recent triennial reviews that have taken place. The certification processes were considered alongside the records and the requirements of the current conformity assessment standard, ISO 17065. During the assessment, mandatory findings were raised in connection with the clarity of the certificate and the change in the certificate holder's name. In addition, recommendations were made in relation to possible improvements to the competence management system to improve the time interval between training and authorization as competent, the overview information included within the front page of the certificate, and knowledge of training and awareness in fire testing. So, do you understand that when an assessment is conducted to the standard of ISO 17065, it will involve an assessment of the body's processes, it's themselves?
Yes.
And whether they followed those processes as a separate issue?
Yes.
And when the report says the certification processes were considered alongside the records, that's really the report acknowledging that the assessor has considered those processes and the robustness of them. Is that right?
I would assume so, yes.
Does UKAS consider whether that process is robust and fit for purpose?
Yes.
Now, we saw, I think, a report that the report included the assessment, that the assessment included a review of the records. Can we go to page 6 of this report, please? And under evaluation 7.4, it says, a review was made of the records of the evaluation that had taken place, along with the content of the certificate. Particular focus was made on the fire test reports and the evaluation reports completed at the time of the assessment. And in the next paragraph, the report lists the certificates that were considered. And if we pick it up, 3 lines from the bottom of the paragraph, starting with test results. Have you found that?
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry.
Yes, sorry.
Test results stated in all above reports were consistent with expectations of the testing carried out on the 2 products and reflect the data for behaviour in relation to fire information in section 6 of 084510 certificate, that is the Rainabond certificate. Now, that rather reads to me as though the assessors looked at the fire classification reports and made sure that they were correctly stated on the Rainabond certificate without obvious error. Is that how you read that?
Yes, I think so.
In his witness statement, Mr. Randall confirmed that the assessors didn't consider all of the documents in the BBA's technical file, but rather sampled documents with a focus on the information which directly supported the certificate content in relation to fire performance. Is that the approach that you would have expected the assessors to have taken?
What, sorry, which, not sure of the question. Do you mean in relation to not looking at all of the documents?
Yes, effectively. Would it be helpful to go to Mr. Randall's statement to see exactly what he says?
Yes, potentially. I think if the question is, this was an extra assessment with a purpose of looking at the certificates in relation to the products of concern. So I think in his statement, the reference to not looking at all of the records is his statement, I suppose, if that was the case. But there may be, without being familiar with the content of what would be in the technical file, what would be in the file, there may be a good reason as to why not all of the documents were looked at.
Certainly, and of course the technical file will include an assessment of durability, of coating, of painting, of those sorts of issues. But if Mr. Randall and Mr. Patterson were looking at the classification reports with relation, as listed there in the document on your screen, if they were looking at those reports and making sure that they were recorded accurately on the BBA certificate, would that be the sort of approach you would expect an assessor to take? You wouldn't expect, I gather, for the assessors to look at every page in the technical file on this assessment?
Not necessarily.
Can we now turn to the assessment report at page 10? That's this document, page 10. At the top, we see it's an appendix. It's the technical assessor's notes, and this is Dan Patterson's notes. And he lists the documents that he's seen. The first there is the certificate itself. Then we see the European classification reports, and then we see copies of reports from WARAS, which we understand to be the body now known as Warrington Fire. And there follows a whole page of commentary about his examination of the Rainer Bond certificate, including a number of improvement actions. Can we take from this that the assessment included a detailed review of the contents of the certificate?
It would appear to be the case, yes.
Can we have this document up side by side with the Rainer Bond certificate, which is ARC 50687? So on the left, we've got the assessment report, and on the right, we have the BBA certificate. Can we go to page 5 of the document on the right, the certificate? And we see at clause 6.3, it says, as a consequence of section 6.1 and 6.2, the products may be regarded as having a class 0 surface in relation to the approved document B. Now, if we look at the third bullet point on the document on the left, where the WARAS reports are set out, you can take it from me that these are explicitly for the version of Rainer Bond with a fire retardant core. There is no evidence on the BBA file that the polyethylene cored product ever achieved National Class 0. Now, I appreciate you're not a cladding expert nor a fire expert, but is that the sort of detail you would expect an assessor to have considered in an assessment?
Yes, I think so.
Now, if we stay on this page in the assessment report, the document on the left, but can we go up to page 3 of the document on the right, the Rainer Bond certificate? At the bottom, we see a diagram which shows the product in a flat form, sometimes we call that the riveted form, and one which is folded, and we can see at the top, we see that's called a cassette system. Now, looking at the documents listed in the report on the left, you can take it from me that the European classification reports are specifically and expressly for the product in the flat form, not the cassette form. And the reports that are known as the WARAS reports, they're of a test that only tests the material in a flat form. There's no mention in this diagram of or in the text of the certificate that the fire performance claims are only for the product in its flat form. Is that something you might have expected to be considered in an assessment?
Yes, I think we would expect the certification body to take that information into account.
But not just the certification body. When UKAS comes and inspects, inspector not being the correct word, when UKAS comes and assesses a conformity body, isn't UKAS looking to see that the BBA has effectively got that right?
Yes, for the sample of the certificates that they're looking at.
Yeah, and when they're looking at this as a sample in the context of a fire and UKAS thinking this might be a product of concern, that is the sort of thing that you would expect a technical assessor to look at, isn't it?
Yes.
I want to turn now to competence. And I think it's been all your evidence already, but to confirm, competence of staff is an aspect that UKAS will routinely assess, isn't it?
Staff of the
conformity assessment body.
Yes.
Yeah. And in fact, UKAS did consider the competence of people at the BBA in this assessment. And I can tell you that UKAS considered the competence of Valentina Amoroso, who was the project manager of the Reynabond certificate in 2017. And I can also tell you that in the follow-up assessment in August 2017, UKAS also analysed Mr. Pranicomo's records, and he had more senior responsibility for this certificate in 2017. So UKAS has clearly assessed the competence of the people in post in 2017. But at initial certification in 2008, the project manager was Hamo Gregorian, and his senior was Mr. Brian Haynes. And in fact, we saw him referred to in the assessment plan. Can I just go to something that Carrie Randall says about this in his witness statement, UKAS 2011424, page 18. Paragraph 23.1. It was noted during the extra visit that records of training and authorisation for the staff that conducted the original certification were not reviewed during the assessment and should be reviewed at a later date. This will be included within the 2022 assessment. During the UKAS assessment, there was a focus on the competence management procedures that were in place at the time of the UKAS assessment and the records relating to staff that were current at the time of the UKAS assessment. Now, if UKAS was looking at the initial certification work of Reynabond, shouldn't the competency of Mr. Gregorian and Mr. Haynes have been considered at that time?
Yes, I think it's part of the looking at the records for that certificate, that would be potentially included in the assessment.
Do you know why it wasn't on that occasion?
No, I don't.
And we saw Mr. Randall said that it will be included in 2022, the assessment to come. There's been a full 4-year cycle since this extra assessment. Can you account for why it's only in 2022 that this will be considered?
Only in so much as I think when this request was made, I believe Carrie's had a look to see whether it has been covered since then, and there isn't a record of it. So that doesn't necessarily mean it hasn't been covered, but the fact that there isn't a record means that would be something that must be revisited.
Yeah, is it something that's just been missed?
It would appear so.
And Mr. Gregorian, I can tell you, retired in 2010. Mr. Haynes retired in 2008, and he has since sadly died. The BBA certificate for Reynabond was actually withdrawn in 2019. My question is, if UKAS were going to uncover something relevant about the BBA's historic work on the Reynabond certificate, wasn't the time to investigate this in 2017, while the certificate was still in circulation?
Yes, I think in the context of the assessment, it was identified. I think that first extra assessment wasn't a particularly long assessment. It was picked up to be followed up, and it was missed. Or it appears to have been missed. There is no record of it, at least.
Yes, yes. I'm going to turn now to outsourcing. We know from the file on the BBA's work of this certificate that the BBA emailed Sarah Colwell from the BRE to ask about an aspect of fire performance of Rainabond. I want to talk briefly about subcontracting or outsourcing. Can we go to BSI 401913? This is the British Standard EN, or BSEN 45011. This was one of the predecessor standards for 17065. And we can see it's called General Requirements for Bodies Operating Product Certification Systems. Can we go to page 7, please? Paragraph 4.4 in the left-hand column, subcontracting. And it says, when a certification body decides to subcontract work related to certification, for example, testing or inspection, to an external body or person, a properly documented agreement covering the arrangements, including confidentiality and conflict of interest, shall be drawn up. And then it goes on, the certification body shall, and there's a number of requirements, including at C, for example, obtain the applicant's consent. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
Yeah. Now, it's right that under this standard, which would have been applicable in 2008, a body most certainly can outsource certificate evaluation activities, can't it?
Yes, it can.
But if it does, it has to be within the parameters set out in this standard, doesn't it?
Yes.
Now, I'm afraid we can't say whether the BBA had a properly documented agreement in 2007 with the BRE, but isn't the relevant point for UKAS that if the BBA were subcontracting, they should have had a relationship documented, shouldn't they?
If they were subcontracting, yes.
Yeah, and UKAS would need to see those documents to make sure that they were in conformance with this standard, wouldn't they?
Yes, we would.
Can we go to the exchange between the BRE and the BBA briefly? It's in the technical file at BBA 408042. And can we go to page 505, please? Now, this is midway through an email exchange, which starts on page 507. Can we start at the second email from the top on this page? And it's from Sarah Colwell to Hamo Gregorian, copying Brian Haynes, on the 29th of November 2007. And she says, we would need to see the test data to be able to make any meaningful comment on the potential product performance. If you would like us to complete a review, we would be happy to look at this for you and provide a proposal if necessary for any additional work or formal assessment. And if we scroll up to the top email on this page, we can see that Mr. Gregorian has responded. I was not able to contact you by telephone, hence email. The attached documents are classification reports for the standard and fire retardant versions. He goes on to talk about the tests and invites her to telephone him. And we can see that there's attachments, and they appear to us to be the relevant fire classification reports. Now, should UKAS have seen from the file that the BRE had been approached to provide advice on fire performance for the issue of this certificate?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Should UKAS have, on inspection of this file, seen that the BRE had been approached to provide fire advice?
If this document was in the file,
I can certainly confirm this document was in the file.
then we should have seen it.
Should the BBA have alerted the assessors during the extra visit that this request for advice had happened?
Possibly, if this had then been the mechanism by which they'd gained the expertise or the advice to do the work.
Yeah. Should the BBA have recorded somewhere that it had had technical input, or at least that a request had been made for technical input from the BRE?
Yes, if that was the course of action that they took. I suppose there is a potential that they may not have pursued this, and this was an inquiry and they took an alternative route.
Yes. In the event, this is more or less all we have of this inquiry. There is, on this file, no further response from Ms. Colwell or anyone from the BRE on this point. Would UKAS, in the event that BRE declined to respond or didn't respond, would UKAS expect to see documents recording that and discerning what the next step was?
Yes, I think our main focus would be on how they access the expertise to perform the certification activity.
Yes, and in the event that the BRE did not respond on a technical question, would UKAS want to see how that response had been closed out and that technical question resolved?
I think the latter would be more significant rather than, because if they'd taken another route, then
Yes.
what happened with this correspondence perhaps would be less significant.
Yes, so it's your evidence that UKAS would want to see how that technical question was resolved, is that right?
Yes, assuming this was the subject of the assessment, this was included within
Yes.
the assessment.
Yes. Should UKAS have investigated and assessed the formal arrangements that may or may not have been in place between the BBA and the BRE at this time?
Actually, at this extra visit, I think that may have depended on what the assessment team saw. Generally, yes. There are potentially sort of two types of arrangement you described from the clauses in 45,011, EN 45,011, subcontracting. There is also scope for the certification body to contract in expertise to work within their own management system, which although the sort of outcome is the same because they're accessing expertise to perform their conformity assessment work, the mechanisms by which they contract that expertise might be different.
Yes, but do you understand that it was that second route that the BBA was contracting in the BRE?
I don't know. I suppose there is a potential for it to be either route.
And if the BBA were contracting the BRE in, as you say, or as I say, the second route, UKAS would want to see the documentation and the management of that, wouldn't you?
Yes, yes.
I'm turning now to triennial reviews. Earlier, we saw that the whistleblower said that the Rayner bond certificate had not been reissued since 2008. And certainly, in his view, it should have been. We can tell from the assessment report that UKAS considered the BBA's triennial reviews. Can we go to that report, UKAS 301077 at page 7? And at the bottom, we see a header, Triennial Certificate Review. So that's the start of the report. Can we go over the page of that subject in the report? Can we go over the page to page 8? And if we go down to the conclusion of that section, just above the header, Reissue, and it says this: overall, the information viewed gave good confidence that BBA are following their processes relating to surveillance, including those for triennial reviews of certification. In addition, the information gave confidence that the review process is effective. Now, this inquiry's heard evidence that, at least from 2013, the review process included writing to the client, so the manufacturer in this case, to request confirmation that there had been no changes that would invalidate the certificate. And the documents on the BBA's technical files show that Arconic did not provide any confirmation. Nonetheless, the BBA decided to close out the review without that information. Now, the effect of that is that the BBA did not receive new fire test data or classifications between the years of 2008 and 2017. And some might say that the certificate lacked information because of that. We asked Carrie Randall about that. Can we go to his witness statement at page 20, UKAS 2011424? At question at 28, did you consider the fact that in project reviews between 2013 and 2017, Arconic did not respond to BBA project manager requests for information, confirmation that there had been no changes in the product? And the response is this: yes, during the assessment, records were viewed that showed there was a period where the certificate holder did not respond. The more recent information viewed showed that the review process was being followed and the information supporting the certificate had been reviewed. The records of factory production control were also viewed in connection with this. During the follow-up visit, it was noted that the certificate holder had responded to information requests following threats from the BBA that the certification would be withdrawn. An inquiry question 29 is, if not, should UKAS have noted and or acted on any of the above? And the response at 29.1 is not applicable. It appears from that the UKAS assessor did note that Arconic hadn't responded. Is that what you take from that?
Yes.
Is it not relevant to UKAS that for years Arconic failed to respond to confirm that there were no changes affecting the validity of the certificate?
It would be relevant to the assessment, yes.
Yeah, surely it's of the utmost relevance to the integrity of the BBA's review.
It's certainly something that would need to be considered, yes.
This assessment was of the entire history of the Rainabond certificate, as far as I understand it, and several years seem to be entirely unaccounted for. In those circumstances, shouldn't UKAS have paid very close attention to the fact that the BBA simply closed the review without information from Arconic about the fire performance of the product?
I think it will depend on the information that they saw at the assessment as to whether there was an impact when they did receive the information, whether what the data showed.
Well, if we look at what Mr. Randall said that they did show, can we just scroll up to 28.1 on the witness statement? He's saying that the review process was followed. Information supporting the certificate had been reviewed. That information was as listed at page 10 of the assessment report. We saw the 2005, 2006 European certificates, the 2003 certificates, classification reports, I mean. The records of factory production control, that's where an auditor goes and watches the material being made. But there were no further fire classification reports that were viewed in this period. So the information, that is the total of the information, certainly from Mr. Randall's account, that had been assessed. So shouldn't UKAS have paid very close attention to what may well have been a gap in the data that was provided to the BBA?
I would expect so, yes. It is. I think we have to look at the report again and also consider Not having been present at the assessment, it is difficult to tell, but I appreciate we've only got the records to go from.
Yes. Well, we can tell from those records that there wasn't any further fire classification reports provided for that period, 2013 and 17. And it is almost as though that it was considered enough that there was factory production control and information from 2005, and the missing years didn't matter. Is that not a fair assessment?
I don't think it's fair to say that the missing years didn't matter. I think we can't tell from the records what the position was of the assessors, because if they had been missing the information, it wasn't necessarily the case that the tests would have been repeated, but they would need to seek confirmation that the test data that they had was valid, which I think is which is the key point, is understanding that the basis on which the certification continues is that the information that has been taken into account is still relevant or been updated.
That the information taken into account is still relevant or updated. We see here, during the follow-up visit, it was noted that the certificate holder had responded to information requests following threats from the BBA that the certificate would be withdrawn. I can tell you the BBA did not ask for every updated fire classification report issued since 2005. And we know that because this inquiry has seen those classification reports giving a very different fire performance. So in that circumstance, isn't it fair to say that UKAS did not pursue the BBA's collection of data for those years?
That would seem to be the case.
Yeah. We've heard evidence in this inquiry from Mr. Nakomo. He was a technical expert at the BBA. He said that if a certificate holder did not reply, such as in this example, it was the BBA's practice to conclude that the review of the information, to conclude the review just with the information from previous years. Now, if that were the process, that should be documented, shouldn't it?
Yes, it should be, yes.
And if that were the process, would UKAS consider the merit and robustness of that as a course of action for the BBA to take? Here, for example, whether it is just acceptable to proceed to certify in absence of an answer from Arconic.
No, we should, yes.
Would, insofar as you can say, would UKAS consider a process where a certification body can simply ignore a client's failure to respond as being robust?
No.
Can we go to the improvement actions raised as a part of this assessment? It's in a native document, UKAS 301074. Can we go to the worksheet called Actions, please? Thank you. Now, in row, this is a how UKAS produces its reports, isn't it, for improvement actions?
Yes.
Now, if we go to row 9, we can see that this action is, I can summarise it, this is an action to change the name from Alcoa to Arconic. And that's we can see in column I, there's an M, meaning it's a mandatory action. So the BBA will change the name on the certificate to the correct legal entity. Can we scroll down to 13, row 13? Now, this in column E says, since there is no 18-metre height limit stated in the 084510 certificate, and the certificate is only applicable for up to 18 metres use because of the tests detailed in the certificate, the photograph of the building on the front of the certificate is misleading, as it is clearly above 18 metres in height. And again, in column I, we can see that's a mandatory action. And column H, we can see this is already in progress. So that's the BBA's response. They will change the picture when they reissue the certificate. And I can tell you, in fact, the certificate was reissued in August 2017, and it did have the right name, and it did have a shorter building on it. As far as this assessment is concerned, those two mandatory actions were closed, weren't they?
Yes.
But the certificate was in circulation for nearly 10 years by then. Is it enough for UKAS to say, well, the error has now been spotted, and from now the certificate will be right? Is that sufficient?
Do you mean in terms of any other action?
Yes.
That is needed? I think clearly there would need to be communication between the certification body and the customer in that circumstance where the certificate has been issued. What becomes more problematic is then what happens to, because the certification body issues the certificate to the manufacturer, what happens to it after that? Where it might be given to other people, for example, passed on. So the certification body, we would expect them to have a conversation with the organisation that they've issued the certificate to.
Yes.
And to ensure that actions are taken to prevent any other misunderstanding in relation to the original certificate.
Yes, that's not recorded as any kind of improvement action. Is that in keeping with your evidence that it wouldn't necessarily be recorded as an improvement action? It's an expectation, or?
I can't account for
Sure.
why it's not been recorded. I can just say that would be my expectation.
Yeah. There was a further extra visit in August 2017. I just want to touch on that very briefly. Can we go to the assessment report at UKAS 301083? And we can see it at the top, it's an extra visit, and we can see it's the August 2017 one. And on the left, partway down, we can see that Carrie Randall and Sam Giles were in attendance for UKAS. Let me just scroll down. Yes, thank you. Now, you can take it from me that the objective of this review, or this further assessment, was to follow up on the actions from the July assessment and to assess work done to reissue a number of certificates covering ACM, which were similar to the Rayner Bond certificate. Can we go to page 5 of the assessment report, please? And here we see in the table a list of 9 certificates which the BBA were reissuing. Now, one of the points that UKAS considered in this assessment was the input of fire experts. Can we just go to the bottom of page 5? And the very, very bottom, you can see table 2, and it says file review overview relating to certificate 084510, which is the Rayner Bond certificate. Now, in that table, if we just go over the page to page 6, the 4th paragraph down, it says, the records relating to the fire experts' comments were viewed. Now, just pausing there, we did ask Mr. Randall about this, and it's his evidence that those comments were not just about the Rayner Bond certificate, they were about all of the further certificates that were being analysed. So just to be clear, although that is in the Rayner Bond assessment, it's actually as regards all of the certificates. I can ask you just to carry on with this paragraph. The records relating to fire experts' comments were viewed. The BBA demonstrated correspondence undertaken with Exover Warrington. Confirmation had been sought that expert comments relating to fire performance previously made continued to be appropriate. Exover Warrington confirmed that they would stand by comments made previously. Now, we have a document in the UKAS file for this assessment from Exover, and it's at UKAS 301080. Can we just go to that, please? And can we go straight to page 3, please? And towards the bottom, we see an email from Nisha Sharma of the BBA, and she's emailed Janet Morrell and Andy Kearns of Exova. And at the 4th paragraph down, she says, in the past, you have provided your opinions, comments on the assessment of the fire performance of various constructions. In light of the recent fire incident, can you please confirm that you stand by these opinions? Then if we scroll up to the bottom of page 2, on the 17th of July from Andy Kearns is an email. And can we just, so that's the beginning of the email. Can we just go down to page 3? He says, as most of these are yours, can you respond back to Nisha? The middle of page 2 from Janet Morrell, email timed, yes, that's it, the middle, it's 17th of July. She says, Nisha, our opinions are based on test evidence, interpretation of standards and regulations, and also expert judgment. Exova Warrington Fire confirmed that our responses to your questions were, in our opinion, correct at the time of provision. At the bottom of page 1, we see Ms. Sharma's response to Mr. Albon, a very prompt and good response for us received from Janet regarding our question posed to Exova last Friday, smiley face, smiley face. And then at the top of page 1, we go, the very top of page 1, email from John Albon to Brian Moore, who was the Executive Director of the BBA. We've received the assurance requested from Exova, re their fire opinions, please see below. Now, looking at that correspondence, and I've taken you through all of it, that exchange is vague as to which advice from Exova Warrington Fire it relates to, isn't it?
Would appear so, yes.
It doesn't make clear that Janet Morrell looked at anything relevant to this assessment, does it?
You can't. I can't see that from this correspondence. No.
No, it's something of a blanket statement, isn't it? That Exova's Morrell.
Would appear to be the case, yes.
And it might be said that in this exchange, the BBA was not making a genuine inquiry about the certificates it was updating. It was just covering itself. Do you agree with that?
I can't really comment on the motivation for the question, but it's not clear as to what opinions and advice that they're referring to from what I could see here.
Carrie Randall said in his witness statement that he was not aware of what work, if any, Janet Morrell had done to check her opinions were technically correct, such that the BBA could rely on them. Isn't it part of UKAS's role to assess how the BBA verified statements about the fire performance on which it relied?
That would be included in our assessment. I would expect that to be included in the assessment, yes.
Should the assessor have satisfied himself that there had been a robust evaluation by Exova Warrington Fire in order to make sure that the fire advice provided on the certificates was right?
Yeah, yes. But I think I'd also say that although this was an extra assessment to look at this, it would be potentially difficult for the assessment team to look at everything. So I can't account for what they may have chosen to look at. I think the point is, yes, it would be included. It's the sort of thing that we would expect to see. Whether there is the particular reason for not looking at one aspect of it, it's hard for me to justify one way or the other now.
Very well. We saw that the BBA was amending and reissuing 9 ACM certificates. And we can certainly see in the assessment report that they were looked at in some detail, or at least some of them were looked at in some detail. But if there were 9 certificates being reissued all at the same time after the fire, doesn't that, or shouldn't that have put UKAS on alert that something had gone wrong with the certification process historically?
That is a possibility because, but equally, if they've identified something with one certificate, you would expect them to review all of the relevant certificates and make that change. I think if I speak generally,
Of course.
it would be would depend on the nature of that problem, because if, for example, a certificate template was needed to be amended, then all of the certificates would be amended. But you know, I think that's if all of the certificates needed to be changed because of material information contained within them, then yes, that would suggest that there is an issue.
When you say issue, that something is...
That something is not happened as it should have done.
Yeah. Can we go now to UKAS 20010852? This is an email chain between the BBA and UKAS in July 2017. On page 2, there's an email from Claire Curtis-Thomas on the 13th of July. It's timed 17:21, yes. And she says this, she's writing to Carrie Randall, the assessor. Carrie, I've been asked to forward your report to our insurer, who are not experts in these matters. I've explained that the outcome of the audit was that UKAS found our record in good order, etc. Apart from your report, is there also a covering letter which allows the layperson to contextualise the outcome of the audit? Kindest regards, Claire, and we can see at the bottom that she is the CEO of the British Board of Agreement, or was at the time. Now, do conformity assessment bodies often ask UKAS to write a letter to their insurers?
No, that's not a common occurrence.
Is it usual practice for UKAS to agree to write a letter to a body's insurers?
No.
Do you take Claire Curtis-Thomas to really be asking UKAS to explain to insurers that actually the assessment the BBA did was good?
I don't know.
Oh, at page 1, we can see that this was escalated to the Chief Executive, Paul Stennett. These email at the top. And 4 lines from the top, starting at, if we are asked. Have you found that?
Yes.
If we are asked for any form of covering letter to accompany this or any future reports, we should refuse to provide any interpretation or comment other than factual statements, e.g., this report relates to a surveillance cost carried out as part of the 4-year, I think he means, accreditation cycle, or whatever the purpose was. Now, that's a firm no, isn't it?
Yes.
Are you aware of a direction to only provide factual statements about reports, no interpretation or commentary?
That would be the usual thing, yes.
In fact, Mr. Stennett, is it your evidence that Mr. Stennett didn't need to really say that? That should always be the case.
Yes, that would always be the case. And also a general, our direct communication will be with the conformity assessment body rather than a third party. It would be by exception that we would give information elsewhere.
In effect, the report stands on its own. It doesn't need any contextualisation as far as UKAS is concerned. Would you agree with that?
That's right, yes.
Can we go to UKAS 301411? This is an email, again, from Claire Curtis-Thomas on the 22nd of August, 2017. And she says, second paragraph, the last few months have been very challenging for all. I just wanted to thank you for the way that you have managed your activities in relation to the BBA. We value our relationship with UKAS, and our organisation has benefited enormously from your comments and advice. We look forward to working with you in the future and to welcoming you back to the BBA. And if you go to the top, you can see that Mr. Giles has forwarded this within UKAS to Mr. Stennett and Jackie Burton. He says, Paul, please see below from BBA CEO. Jackie, I think this may be positive feedback. Now, is he forwarding that to Ms. Burton in her role as feedback manager?
Yes, I assume so.
Does UKAS collect positive feedback
Yes,
from
we do.
conformity?
Yes, we do.
Can we go now can we actually return to a document we've seen? It's UKAS 10860. This is Mr. Giles' assessment, his summary of testing certification related to Grenfell Tower. We have seen this before. This was from around September 2017. On page 1, there's a header, certification of fire-resistant materials. And do I understand correctly that Mr. Giles would be referring to the BBA in this section, and possibly also Exover as well?
I would take it as read. He makes reference to BBA.
Yes. At the bottom of the page, there's a header called Summary. And it says, and I believe, but I will stand corrected if I'm wrong, he's referring to both the BBA and quite possibly Exover Warrington. And he says, both organisations have issued multiple certifications. Thus, it is impossible without unlimited resource to review every file. However, a review of how sampling is carried out on certification may be required to ensure that a representative selection is assessed thoroughly. Now, by reviewing sampling, do you understand, Mr. Giles, to mean that UKAS should look at how it selects certificates to assess?
I think that's what that means, yes.
And did UKAS review how certificates were assessed for organisations such as the BBA's Agremont scheme?
I think the recommendations from this work was fed back into our operations teams through the section heads. That work was coordinated by our operations director. So I think, yes, it's been actioned.
On page 2 of this document, this summary section continues. UKAS assessors need to be more thorough in the evaluation of training records. There may have been in tendency in the past to accept lists of competencies without further documentation to support this. For example, training, tests, supervised working with sign-off. Now, do you agree, certainly on your view of the documents, that there may have been a tendency for UKAS to just accept a conformity assessment body's competence without full documentation?
I think there has that we have identified occasions where that has been the case.
And in terms of products used on Grenfell, would you say that identification, that you have identified occasions where there has been a tendency just to accept competency?
I don't know specifically, but I would assume if this statement had been made as a consequence of that work, those additional assessments, then that would appear to be the case.
Would it be fair to say that since 2017, UKAS has focused much more on the BBA's Agremont scheme than before the fire?
Yes.
Now, just stepping back and looking at what is really a vast amount of information and documents, accreditation by UKAS confers on the conformity assessment body a degree of respect and confidence, doesn't it?
Yes.
That's the point of accreditation. It gives consumers confidence in product systems and services, doesn't it?
Yes, the point of accreditation is to confirm the competence of the conformity assessment body, which in turn, where their results and information data is used to confirm product compliance or that it meets specifications, then yes.
Well, considering the topics that we've discussed in your evidence, do you think that there might be some areas where UKAS should have detected or dealt with weaknesses in those bodies earlier?
Yes.
Looking back, do you accept that UKAS accreditation might have given confidence to users of products where that confidence was not completely deserved?
It's the information on the certificates issued by the conformity assessment bodies is the extent of that information and how that relates to the accreditation. Where that information does relate to their where that information is an outcome from an accredited process, then yes.
Has UKAS done anything particular to address any confidence it may have given without full evidence?
In relation to the conformity assessment bodies here, then yes, we've continued to focus on these areas when we've conducted their assessments. We have also, not directly as a consequence of this work, but really since the standard that we use for product certification bodies was updated in 2012, and further guidance has been issued since then on schemes, we have increased our focus on conformity assessment scheme review, and we've retrained the relevant staff on conformity assessment scheme review, and we have undertaken or are undertaking a review of all of the product certification schemes. And in the case of the construction products, that work started last year.
Yes. So I've come to the end of my prepared questions. Could we please take a break to see if there are any questions?
Yes,
from
we'll do that in just a minute. I've just got one question I'd like your help with before we have a break. Does UKAS concern itself with the extent to which there may be contact between the certifying body and the product manufacturer? One can see there's a danger that there could be too close a relationship between the manufacturer of the product and the body certifying its fitness for purpose. Is that something which UKAS is concerned by?
Yes, we are concerned by that because it's important that a product certification body is a third party. So the relationship, clearly there will need to be a relationship with the manufacturer as their client. And how the certification body manages its impartiality, monitors its impartiality, is an important part of its meeting the requirements for, in this case, for ISO 17065.
And how do you monitor that?
Well, we'll look at the records. We will look at any committee structure or mechanisms that they have to oversee their impartiality. It's quite common that a certification body will have what's called an impartiality committee that will look at how that is being monitored. They'll conduct audits. So they themselves, in fact, I think you've seen at least one of these certification bodies here, they've engaged their non-executive directors to participate in impartiality audits, for example.
Yeah. All right. Thank you very much. And do you want to follow that up at all?
No.
Not at the moment, anyway.
Not at the moment.
No. Well, when Council gets to the end of her prepared questions, we have to have a short break, both so that she can take stock and also to enable others who are not in the room but are following the proceedings to suggest questions that perhaps we ought to have asked you. So we'll stop now. We'll resume at 3:15, please, and then we'll see if there are any more questions that we need to ask you. All
Okay,
right?
thank you.
Thank you very much. Right, 3:15, please. Thank you. Would you ask Mrs. Turner to come back in, please? Thank you. Right, Mrs. Turner, we'll see if there are any more questions for you. Yes, Ms. Hines.
Sir, there are no further questions. So it remains for me just to thank Mrs. Turner for coming to help us.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, Mrs. Turner. Well, I think I should thank you on behalf of all three members of the panel. It's been very useful to hear what you have to tell us. We found it very interesting, and we're very grateful to you for coming to give your evidence. And I'm sorry that it had to take over the weekend, so to speak, which must have been rather a problem, but still couldn't be helped. Anyway, thank you very much indeed, and you're now free to go.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Hines. Well, there are other witnesses, but not today, I think.
Not
Is that right?
today. Not today. We have Mr. Metcalfe coming tomorrow, and Mr. Millett will be examining him.
Good. Thank you very much indeed. Well, in that case, we'll close for today at that point. We resume tomorrow at 10 o'clock when we shall see the next witness. Thank you very much. 10
Thank
o'clock
you.
tomorrow, please.